now I'd like to introduce to the stage our first session of this segment, James Matcher from EY. He's the America's Intelligent Automation Leader. We'll be talking to Irv Dennis, a retired senior EY partner and former CFO of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development.
That's right.
So, gentlemen, welcome to the stage.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everybody, and great to be here. And Irv, fantastic to be sitting here next to you, talking about such an important topic of how do you elevate automation to a board-level agenda.
Oh, happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And it's going to be a good conversation. It's an important topic.
Looking forward to it. Now, having board-level support to any agenda for an organization is really, really powerful. I mean, the ability to get strategic direction, focus, access to resources and funding, and ensuring that any agenda sits within the organization's execution plans. So the question is always, what has automation done to earn its right and seat and table at a board-level agenda? And why now? Why not 5 years ago? Why not 5 years from now? And I think it comes down to one major thing: market competitiveness. No one will refute the comment that digital technology is now at the backbone of what every organization does. But in itself doesn't necessarily have equal competitive capabilities across the spectrum. For example, no clients today compete against each other based on their system of record or ERP. Whether I have SAP or Oracle is not a point of competitiveness. Nor do people compete at the application layer. And whether I have application A or application B does not create a point of differentiation. It's interesting, though, that the way you wield them and deploy them and use them has an impact, but in itself is not a point of distinction. Organizations today compete with each other at the digital domain. That plethora of technologies, techniques, methodologies, and tools is where organizational strategy is defined and broken in an organization and the world that we see today. Now, if we look across the digital domain, automation is becoming a significant backbone to any digital agenda, no matter how they look and shape. And this is now what's causing the organization to think about it a bit differently. But we also kind of say, well, automation means different things to different people. I mean, some organizations are starting out, some are quite advanced, and that continuum is quite profound. And I think it may be worthwhile spending a bit of time understanding one of these evolutionary curves in this continuum of automation and why it gives us that competitive advantage in the market.
You know, it's interesting you ask why now from a board perspective, and technology changes very quickly all the time, and it continues to do so. And I think you're going to talk about the kind of Gen 1, 2, and 3 as we go through. And it's really imperative that boards focus on this now and think about it in a strategic way going forward. And the way I think of it from a board perspective is every company, no matter what you do, is a technology company, and they need to think of themselves as a technology company, and that'll drive the agenda to make sure they keep current with their competitors.
That's so true. So maybe spend a few minutes now actually talking about this evolutionary curve. I think it's quite insightful. And when we look at automation over the general, where it's come from and where it's going to, there are three primary evolutionary curves. Generation 1 is where we've been for the last sort of 7 odd years. RPA focused, it laid the foundation of automation, digital engagement, and it also allowed the maturation to occur of the technologies themselves. So Gen 1 will always be seen as the RPA-focused area. Nowadays, we're moving into sort of a Gen 2 curve where organizations are now shifting. And this is about integration, and it's been driven by basically 3 things. Firstly, when we look across a complex process landscape, it's impossible for one technology to single-handedly transform a process and drive out value. You need multiple technologies working together. Secondly, as you start driving through that value chain, we often found that use cases defined a lot of value, but as it went further down that value chain, it actually got caught up in other bottlenecks, inefficiencies, so it muted the strategic impact. And lastly, the evolution of the technologies themselves have changed, not just in their core functionality or capability, but the interoperability as well. The ability to work together in a more seamless and integrated manner is driving what Gen 2 will be. And as we bring these things together, it enables us now to have a material impact on how organizations drive and derive value. I mean, no longer are we talking about a micrometric here or there, but systemically drive value within an organization. And then the third generation, as we move out towards that, is the future. And we're marching steadily in that direction. This is about the infusion of artificial intelligence into the process and the automation fabric. Now, we're not talking here about a use case of machine learning attached to a bit of automation. We're talking about systemic AI platforms at the core of how processes are defined. And it will completely change how these environments will look and feel going forward. And that's going to make a big difference.
You know, it's interesting when you look at this, the chart that you have laid out here between Gen 1, 2, and 3, my sense is that different boards will have different levels of knowledge of this. And I would say a lot of companies are at the Gen 1, or they should be at this point. Hopefully they're striving for Gen 2, and get to the AI-powered automation is going to be really critical. My guess is different boards are at different levels of this, and we'll talk about in a few minutes what that might mean and how boards ought to think about that.
Yeah, and I think seeing the fact that we're sort of moving into the Gen 2 and it's the foundational platform for us to get to a Gen 3 ultimately, let us kind of understand, maybe unpick a little bit as to what that is and how it comes about. And whenever I talk about Gen 2 automation, you've got to see it as a combination of capabilities that work together. And although we all started out with sort of process automation and RPA, that was the backbone, as we started playing more and more in the process and understood the complexity and how they interplay, we start seeing the advent of the sort of process mining, task mining agenda coming out. Workflow becomes important in BPM, so we see that as a capability. In parallel, we see the expansion of sort of analytics to advanced analytics, deriving insight on what the process is doing, and then also extending out to the artificial intelligence spectrum. And bring in sort of everything from machine learning, computer vision, NLP, et cetera, That interplay now also necessitates a more integrated manner in how we work with different applications. So we see the integration layer starting to come into that capability stack. And all of it underpinned on data fabric, the heart of what makes every organization tick. But as these technologies come together, that's only half the problem. Right. Because as you can imagine, the functional side of the house needs to mature as well. Our strategies will look different. The way we do demand generation looks very different from just an automation use case to a full transformational platform that we have now today. Our op models and integration needs to come together, and obviously risk and governance and control. The ability to kind of play both of these on top of each other really becomes impactful because it allows us now to be able to shift metrics at a strategic level. So that makes a big difference.
It makes a big difference, and it's interesting as I look at this, look at these slides and the complexity of it in many people's minds. It'd be interesting to know if you sit down with a board, how many boards really understand this, can see it, and that's why I think it's very important for boards to start thinking about what they know and what their knowledge base is. And if I was advising a board, and the boards I sit on, we think about this. But the first thing a board ought to do is ask themselves in a real honest assessment, what is my digital capability knowledge? Do I really understand what it is today? What are the capabilities? What does it mean to have RPA? What does it mean to have data extraction technologies and the artificial intelligence? And what can it really do for the company? And I would say a lot of boards are probably pretty familiar with this as the interaction between the company and a customer, or maybe the vendors and third parties, and how they interact with iCloud, et cetera. But you've got to bring it internal to your own infrastructure. And if I was a board member of a company that's not blatantly progressed with this, I would ask a question. Give me your productivity measurements from 7 years ago to today, and not just from customer interfacing and customer actions, because again, I think probably boards get that and companies get that, but tell me about your internal infrastructure, whether it be the financial statement close process, your HR processes, your procurement processes, and if you're not about 40% improved productivity in those hours from 7 years ago today, you're probably missing this, and you need to make it part of the strategic imperative for the company. And I would also, as a board member, I would really focus on understanding what the CEO and the CFO's strategic imperatives are. Yeah. Are they thinking about this? The CFOs of companies have a great visibility into a complete life cycle of their processes. And any routine process you have that people are doing or a workforce is doing can be converted to automation. And if someone is opening up emails and reading them and pushing information around, pushing numbers around, that can all be done by automation and a machine. And it would be really important for a company and a board to understand that, and you can really drive efficiencies. And
You know, I had the luxury of spending 37 years with EY, so I spent a lot of time with large companies and audit committees and boards. And upon retirement, as it was mentioned earlier, I went to be the CFO at HUD, and they were very far behind in their digital capabilities. So I led that effort, and I would say government's probably about 4 or 5 years behind the private sector, but I think both have a long way to go. There's a tremendous opportunity. And it just has to be an imperative at the board level. And when you think about it from the CFO and the C-suite, CFOs and CEOs need to be very proactive with their boards and educate them. And if a board needs education, if they don't have the right mix on the board, you know, maybe bring a board member on that does, or bring outsourced information to get themselves educated. But I think a CFO and CEO can really drive this agenda and help educate the board. I think companies need to think about, do they have the workforce of the future? Yeah. Does their workforce currently exist to drive this digitalization and automation? And if not, where do you get that expertise? You know, bring outside help in, go through training exercises, make sure you're hiring the right people that can think about the future, and have a detailed plan, put a plan in place. And you know, a lot of this is culture, and it could drive cultural change. And that's one of the things that we did at HUD. We put a pretty simple framework in place, but that framework is easier laid out than it is to execute.
So you advocate a strong framework to kind of bring us to life, as opposed to just sort of bringing the knowledge and just let it evolve organically.
Exactly. And the framework starts with the leadership at the top, and you need to make sure that you have the board level commitment to this and the C-suite level commitment to this. You need stakeholder buy-in, and that stakeholders are your employee base, and if you're changing the way you're doing interactions with your customers or your vendors, make sure that they're bought in as well. Governance is very important, and then the detailed plan. And this framework I put in place is how I drove it at HUD, and these aren't done in isolation. They're all very interconnected. You start in one and you keep it going. I'm going to do a little shameless plug here that I actually had the opportunity to write a book on how we went about that, and this it's called Transforming a Federal Agency. It's published by Wiley, coming out on November 1st. But in the book, I go through all the important aspects of this and what it really did take to drive it, and you know, what does the first 100 days look like, and how do you change culture? It's very, very difficult, but it really starts with leadership, having a plan and being committed to the plan. So that's from a board level perspective. You know, I would be absolutely thinking about this, and if you do need a cultural change, think about how you're going to do that within a company.
I think it's fascinating. And just a question, you talked about the interplay between sort of the C-suite and the board. Is it one leading the other, or is it an interplay between each other?
Oh, it's an interplay between each other. You know, I think the board will absolutely help set strategy. The management the C-suite has to drive it. But they need to keep each other current. And again, I think it's really important to do an honest assessment about where is the knowledge base, and make sure the knowledge base is within the C-suite or within the company. And if it's not, you know, I would say at HUD, the knowledge base wasn't inside, so we engaged outside consultants to help us, brought us up the curve, and once we got ourselves educated, the long-term goal would be to have our workforce take over this automation and become experts themselves. But you need to work closely with the board, and the board needs to work closely with management to oversee it.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure everybody here today, they're here because they get the value of automation.
Yes.
But I think what we need to be able to do is go back and be able to elevate to our boards the importance, the competitive advantage Gen 2 automation can do.
Absolutely. And you know, you don't want to be 3 or 4 years down the road and have your competitors well ahead of you in this game. That will not be helpful to. It's not creating shareholder value. It's not helping your company become sustainable. So, if boards are not focused on this now, they need to be. And you know, you and I were chatting earlier about, you know, how do you educate a board? You know, boards are very appropriately focused on cybersecurity and ESG. They're the two very hot topics. I would add this to a board agenda, and as you think about how to educate boards from the different however they get educated, this has to be on. And from a board perspective, we were chatting earlier about where does this sit on a board committee, and I would put it in the enterprise risk management and make it part of the risk management focus and monitoring. And again, with you know, however often you meet, quarterly or annual updates. Make it part of a continuous part of the agenda.
I think
Be
it's
really
so
important.
true. I mean, boards acting as a sort of the stewards of organizational resiliency. It's imperative that they be able to make sure they're bringing this into the platform, because you could be competed against on this agenda alone.
Exactly. Exactly.
No, I think it's fascinating. I think the ability for us to be able to really get the C-suite and boards really connect on the agenda. As practitioners in the market, we need to be able to elevate the profile of what automation is doing to our boards, and then capacitate and train them, educate them on this agenda.
The one thing I'd also say, I know we're going to run out of time here, but from a board perspective, when you think about this, we're not talking about changing out IT systems. That's very costly and very expensive. A lot of this is relatively inexpensive to put on top of your existing processes. And that's what we did at HUD. We didn't change the IT systems. We just brought in all this technology, put it on top, and it made a huge difference. And the employees loved it. I mean, they went away from doing routine, pushing numbers around, to analyzing numbers, and it was a very powerful lesson to them.
Excellent. Well, Irv, thanks so much. And getting your board insight from all the experience has been wonderfully enlightening. And I think we need to get every one of our board members, every one of our organizations on this agenda. I think it's going to make a significant ability for us to really elevate and expand what automation is today. So thank you very much for joining
Thank you.
our thorough
Appreciate
conversation.
Enjoyed it.